The first warning came as a routine diplomatic transmission, the kind that passed through Earth's listening arrays every day and was usually logged, translated, and archived without much concern. But this one carried the seal of the Galactic Council and the formal language of ultimatum, and when the words were rendered into simple English, they stated, without emotion or hesitation, that humanity was to withdraw from 3 newly settled systems, dismantle its deep space shipyards, and submit all military assets for inspection, because several senior species had judged that human expansion had become disruptive and potentially dangerous, and the Council, confident in its ancient authority, expected immediate compliance. And in the first meetings that followed on Earth, some leaders argued for caution, some for negotiation, and some for quiet preparation, yet what none of them could ignore was the tone behind the message, a tone that assumed humans would fold as so many younger. Civilizations had before a tone that carried a faint echo of laughter at the idea that this upstart species from a small yellow star could ever challenge the balance of power that had ruled the galaxy for tens of thousands of years. And while ambassadors were dispatched and carefully worded replies were composed, the fleets of the great empires were already moving, assembling beyond the borders of human space in numbers meant to intimidate rather than immediately destroy, because the Council believed fear alone would be enough. And in their chambers of crystal and light, alien delegates spoke of humanity as if it were a problem of minor significance, a brief disturbance that would be corrected and forgotten, unaware that on Earth and across its colonies, a different decision was forming, one born from centuries of surviving against odds, from wars that had taught humans that surrender rarely brought mercy, and that preparation was the only real guarantee of survival. And so while the Council laughed in private at the stubborn replies coming from a world they considered primitive, orders were being issued in underground command centers. Shipyards that had never gone dark were pushing their reactors beyond safe limits, and captains across the Terran fleets were receiving sealed directives that would change the course of galactic history, even though, for the moment, the stars themselves remained quiet, holding their breath before the storm. Across the vast chamber of the Galactic Council, where gravity was carefully tuned for a dozen species, and the air shimmered with controlled atmospheres layered one within another, the representatives of the old powers reviewed the human response with a mixture of irritation and amusement, for Earth had not submitted, had not withdrawn, and had not dismantled anything, but had instead requested time and parity in negotiations, speaking of mutual security, shared trade, and respect for sovereignty, and this alone was taken as proof of insolence, because in the Council's long memory, only equals spoke that way, and humans were not equals. They were a young race with short histories and short attention spans, a species that had barely stepped beyond its cradle before building warships and spreading across nearby systems, and the senior delegates, whose civilizations had risen and fallen, and risen again while mammals on Earth were still hiding from predators, found the idea that these newcomers demanded to be treated as peers quietly absurd, and so the decision to escalate was made with procedural calm. Fleets that had been gathering as a show of force were ordered across into contested space, not to annihilate, but to demonstrate, to surround the human border colonies, to perform exercises so overwhelming that resistance would appear pointless. And in the minds of the Council strategists, this would be enough, because most species, when faced with such power, chose accommodation over destruction. Yet what they did not fully understand was that humanity's history had trained it to react very differently to encirclement, for on Earth, being surrounded had often been the moment when resolve hardened rather than broke, and as the alien armadas advanced, their drives bending space-time and lighting the dark with the cold glow of advanced physics, human sensors tracked every movement in silence, mapping formations, measuring power outputs, studying patterns of command and control, and in quiet rooms on Luna, Mars, and the deep space stations beyond Jupiter, analysts compared the incoming data with decades of simulations that had once seemed excessive and paranoid, and now appear prophetic, because those simulations had always assumed that if the galaxy ever turned hostile, it would not be a single enemy but a coalition of many confident, technologically superior, and certain of their own invincibility, and the counterplans that emerged from those studies were now being pulled from secure archives, refined and distributed, not as desperate measures, but as carefully constructed doctrines. And when the first alien task forces dropped out of hyperspace near the outer human colonies, spreading into wide, imposing formations meant to be seen, the local populations did not panic. because evacuation protocols had already been executed with calm efficiency. Industrial facilities had shifted to wartime production months earlier under the cover of routine expansion, and the civilian traffic lanes were suddenly empty, leaving only the silent readiness of automated defenses and the distant, gathering mass of the Terran fleets, still hidden, still waiting. While in the council chamber, reports of these movements were dismissed as the nervous shuffling of a species that knew it was about to be corrected, and the laughter, subtle but real, continued. In the outer reaches of the Sol defense perimeter, where the light of the sun was a faint memory, and the void was broken only by the slow drift of comets and the cold geometry of listening platforms, the first true contact between the advancing coalition fleets and the forward elements of the Terran Navy finally occurred. Not in the form of weapons fire, but in the silent exchange of sensor locks and communication pings that carried unspoken challenges, and the alien commanders, viewing the tactical displays in their own command centers, noted with mild surprise that the human ships did not scatter or retreat, but instead maneuvered with disciplined precision, holding positions that denied easy penetration while maintaining overlapping fields of detection, a posture that suggested confidence rather than fear. Yet this was interpreted not as a sign of strength, but as stubborn pride, the kind often seen in younger species that had not yet learned their place. And so the coalition, Admiral, a being whose kind had ruled space for longer than human civilization had existed, ordered a limited demonstration, a controlled advance of several heavy cruisers to cross an invisible line and force the humans to either yield or be brushed aside. And as those massive vessels surged forward, their drives distorting local space and their weapon arrays powering up in a display meant to be unmistakable, the human response was measured and calm, with a simple broadcast sent across all. Frequencies stating that the line they were about to cross marked the boundary of sovereign territory, and that further movement would be considered a hostile act, and in the alien command chambers this message was received with thinly veiled contempt, because such warnings were expected and rarely enforced, and when the cruisers continued their approach, the humans did not immediately fire, but instead executed a series of coordinated maneuvers that brought additional ships out from behind, planetary shadows and debris fields, revealing formations that had been carefully masked until this moment. And the sudden increase in human presence caused a brief pause in the coalition advance, not out of fear, but out of tactical curiosity, as the alien officers recalculated the balance of forces, and concluded that even with these reinforcements, the outcome remained inevitable, and so the order to proceed was given again. Firmer this time, it was only then when the lead cruiser crossed the boundary and its sensors registered a sudden, intense spike of energy from multiple human platforms, that the first shots were fired, not as a wild barrage, but as a precisely timed, concentrated strike that targeted specific subsystems with uncanny accuracy, and within seconds, the great alien ship, built to withstand the fire of entire fleets, found its propulsion failing and its shields collapsing in cascading layers, and as it drifted, powerless, in the dark, the coalition, commanders stared at their screens in stunned silence, because this was not the chaotic resistance of a desperate underdog, but a controlled, efficient application of force by an opponent who knew exactly where to strike. And in that moment, for the first time, a quiet unease began to replace the laughter that had once filled the halls of the Galactic Council. The immobilization of the lead cruiser sent a ripple of confusion to the coalition formation, not because the loss of one ship threatened their overwhelming numerical advantage, but because the manner in which it had been neutralized did not fit the expected profile of human technology, which Council intelligence had long categorized as functional but unsophisticated, relying on brute force rather than refinement. Yet the strike that had just unfolded showed layered coordination between sensors, fire control, and electronic warfare systems that operated with a level of integration usually seen only in the oldest and most advanced fleets. And as damage reports flowed in, they revealed that the human weapons had not simply overwhelmed shields, but had slipped through momentary gaps created by precisely timed interference, exploiting microsecond fluctuations that most targeting doctrines considered too brief to matter, and this suggested a depth of study and preparation that could not have been achieved in the short time humanity had been among the stars, unless, as some junior analysts quietly proposed, the humans had been planning for a war like this from the very beginning of their interstellar age. And while senior commanders dismissed such thoughts as overinterpretation, the fact remained that the forward demonstration had failed, and the next decision had to be made. whether to press the advantage with full force or pause to reassess. And in the end, pride and long. Habit won, because the coalition had never been forced to reconsider by a single skirmish, and the order was given for a broader advance, with multiple task groups moving in coordinated arcs designed to encircle human positions and crush them through sheer mass. And as these formations surged forward, human ships did not retreat, but instead fell back in stages, drawing the alien fleets deeper into carefully chosen volumes of space, where gravitational fields, radiation belts, and the geometry of orbital mechanics limited maneuvering options, and to the coalition tacticians this appeared as a textbook defensive withdrawal, the kind that preceded collapse. Yet in the quiet of Terran command centers, officers tracked the unfolding pattern with calm focus, confirming that the opposing forces were aligning exactly where predicted, and when the signal was finally given, a network of long dormant platforms, hidden among asteroids, in the shadows of moons and within the rings of distant gas giants, came alive, projecting fields and launching munitions that transformed the region into a layered kill zone, not in a single overwhelming blast, but in a sustained methodical sequence that forced the alien fleets to fight on terms they had not anticipated. And as the first coalition destroyers were torn apart by converging fire from vectors they had believed secure, and others found their navigation disrupted by localized distortions that made coordinated movement nearly impossible, a realization began to spread among the alien crews that this was not a simple border enforcement action, but the opening phase of a campaign planned in detail by an opponent who had accepted, long ago, the possibility that the entire galaxy might one day stand against them and had prepared accordingly. As the engagement expanded in the volume of space filled with the cold light of weapons fire and the drifting debris of shattered hulls, the coalition commanders attempted to reassert control for the doctrines that had served them for millennia, ordering their heavier capital ships forward to anchor the line and bring their superior firepower to bear, confident that once the full weight of their fleets was engaged, the humans would be overwhelmed. Yet the moment those massive vessels advanced, they found themselves targeted not by random salvos, but by coordinated strikes that focused on command nodes, sensor arrays, and communication relays, severing the invisible threads that held their formations together. And in several flagships, senior officers watched in disbelief as their tactical pictures fractured into isolated fragments, each showing only a portion of the battlefield, while human units, linked through resilient networks and redundant channels, continued to maneuver as a single coherent force, adapting in real time to every change. And this asymmetry in situational awareness quickly translated into positional advantage, as Terran squadrons appeared where they were least expected, striking exposed flanks, then fading back into regions of space cluttered with natural interference that their navigation systems have been tuned to exploit. And with every exchange, the coalition lost not just ships but confidence, because the humans did not fight with the reckless aggression often associated with younger species, nor with the rigid adherence to ancient patterns that characterized the old powers, but with a blend of flexibility and precision that suggested long experience in adapting under pressure. And as casualties mounted, the first urgent transmissions were sent back to the Galactic Council, reporting that resistance was far stronger than projected and that human capabilities had been significantly underestimated. And in the Council chamber, where the atmosphere quiet amusement had once prevailed, a more serious mood began to take hold, with delegates demanding updated assessments and explanations, and intelligence officers, now poring over decades of overlooked data, began to see a different picture emerging, one in which humanity's rapid technological progress, its constant internal competition, and its history of global conflict had forged a culture uniquely suited to rapid military innovation. And while these revelations spread, on the front lines of battle continued to turn, as human forces, having absorbed the initial weight of the coalition advance, shifted from containment to counteroffensive, pushing outward with measured force, reclaiming zones of space that had briefly been contested, and demonstrating that their earlier withdrawals had not been signs of weakness, but deliberate steps in a larger plan. And for the first time since the coalition fleets had set out, the question was no longer how quickly the humans would be subdued, but whether the coalition could achieve its objectives at all, without paying a price far higher than any of its leaders had ever imagined. The counteroffensive unfolded with a clarity of purpose that left little doubt about the depth of human planning, as task groups that had remained hidden on the far side of planetary systems and within the complex gravitational wells of binary stars now emerged in perfect synchronization. Their arrival time coincided with a moment when the coalition fleets were most extended and least able to support one another, and these Terran formations did not charge blindly, but advance along. Calculated vectors that cut supply lines, isolated forward elements, and forced the alien commanders into a series of difficult choices where every option carried unacceptable risk. And in ship after ship, officers watched as their long-range communications were disrupted by layered jamming and targeted cyber interference that exploited protocols once thought unbreakable, reducing coordination between distant units to slow, unreliable exchanges, while human networks, hardened by decades of preparing for exactly this kind of electronic and informational warfare, continue to function with only minor degradation, and the result was a widening gap in tempo, with Terran forces able to observe, decide, and act faster than their opponents, turning each small advantage into a cascade of larger ones. And as pockets of coalition resistance were encircled and methodically dismantled, the psychological impact became as significant as the physical losses, because the narrative that had sustained the confidence of the old powers, the belief that their technological maturity and numerical superiority guaranteed dominance, was being steadily eroded by an adversary that refused to conform to expected patterns, and reports in the front began to describe human tactics in terms usually reserved for the most feared strategists of galactic history, noting their ability to combine patience with sudden, decisive action and to use the environment of space itself as a weapon, shaping the battle space through control of orbits, energy flows, and lines of approach. And when the first coalition carrier groups were forced to withdraw to avoid complete encirclement, leaving behind damaged escorts and scattered fighter wings, the scale of the ship became impossible to ignore, and emergency sessions were convened on the Council world, where delegates who had once spoken lightly of disciplining a troublesome newcomer now faced the reality that they were engaged in a conflict with a species that had not only anticipated confrontation with superior forces, but had built its entire interstellar security architecture around the assumption that such a day would come and that it would have to stand alone against it. As the conflict deepened and the theater of operations widened across multiple star systems, the coalition's initial strategy of intimidation gave way to a grim effort at containment, with orders issued to consolidate remaining forces around key logistical hubs and defensive strongpoints. Yet even this shift revealed how far the balance had already tilted, because the humans did not rush to exploit every opening with reckless speed, but instead applied steady, relentless pressure, probing each position, identifying weaknesses, and striking only when probability of success was overwhelming. And in doing so, they demonstrated a level of operational patience that confounded opponents who had expected either collapse or desperate overextension. And within the Terran command structure, planners coordinated movements across light years with a precision made possible by layered command redundancy and a culture that encouraged initiative at every level, so that when one element encountered unexpected resistance, nearby units adjusted without waiting for central orders, maintaining the momentum of the overall campaign. And on the coalition side, this flexibility was increasingly lacking as communication delays damaged infrastructure, and the psychological shock of sustained losses eroded confidence in long-standing hierarchies, leading to hesitation and fragmented responses. And it was in this environment that several critical engagements unfolded, where isolated, alien battle groups, attempting to regroup or withdraw, found themselves intercepted by Terran squadrons that arrived not in overwhelming numbers, but with superior positioning and coordination, cutting off escape routes and forcing surrenders that would have been unthinkable at the war's outset. And these scenes, transmitted back through desperate channels, showed human captains offering terms, securing prisoners, and moving on with disciplined efficiency, reinforcing the impression that this was not a chaotic uprising, but controlled campaign with clear objectives and an understanding of both military necessity and political consequence. And as these reports accumulated, the realization spread through the ranks of the old powers that the conflict had crossed a threshold, that it was no longer a matter of correcting a minor disturbance, but confronting a peer, perhaps even a superior, whose approach to warfare integrated technology, strategy, and morale in a way that neutralized the traditional advantages of age and scale. And in the council chamber, where debate now carried an edge of urgency, some delegates began to speak not of enforcement but of negotiation, not of punishment but of limits, Aware that every hour the fighting continued, humanity's position grew stronger, its confidence more justified, and its reputation across the wider galaxy more firmly established as a force capable of standing alone against a coalition and steadily, methodically pushing it back. As the final phase of the campaign unfolded, the galaxy watched in awe and dread as humanity executed maneuvers that combined strategic foresight, technological mastery, and unyielding will, with Terran fleets exploiting every aspect of physics, geography, and timing to neutralize superior enemy numbers, while coalition forces, once confident in their dominance, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn, their one-structure formations fragmented into isolated units struggling to survive under sustained human pressure, and across star systems, from the frozen moons of the outer rim to the asteroid belts surrounding gas giants, humans employed layered defenses, precision strikes, and psychological tactics designed not merely to destroy, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance. While every alien commander witnessing these actions began to understand that the very assumptions that had guided their civilizations for millennia, their faith in numerical superiority, technological edge, and rigid hierarchical control, were irrelevant against a species that combined adaptability, ingenuity, and relentless determination. And as the coalition's strongest fleets fell in succession, the Galactic Council, forced into unprecedented emergency deliberations, could only watch as humanity's approach revealed both the scale of their miscalculation and the sheer depth of preparation that had always underpinned Terran expansion, from hidden shipyards and secret research outposts to centuries of cultural emphasis on innovation and resilience. And in the final engagements, humans did not seek indiscriminate destruction, but systematically dismantled command structures, severed supply lines, and neutralized strategic assets, leaving the council delegates and alien populations with a single inescapable truth: that humanity had never been weak, had never been submissive, and had never underestimated. And as the surviving coalition forces retreated in disarray, the message was clear across the void of space, carried on every sensor and transmission channel. The stars had been quiet, the galaxy had laughed, and now every system knew that Earth and its people were not only capable of surviving, but of shaping the fate of the cosmos. And in the aftermath, as humanity consolidated its gains, repaired its losses, and extended the reach of its influence with measured diplomacy, the aliens finally comprehended the ultimate consequence of their hubris, understanding that they had provoked not a minor species, but a civilization whose brilliance, courage, and unyielding spirit ensured that in the cold expanse of space, humanity would always rise, unstoppable, unbowed, and forever a force the galaxy would never again take lightly.